The ice had been forming on the windows of the Royal Victoria Hospital for 3 days straight. I watched it creep across the glass in slow, silent patterns, the way frost does in a Manitoba winter, when the temperature drops below -30, and the world outside becomes something you can only observe from behind thick walls. My daughter lay in a room 2 floors above me, and I sat in the waiting area with a paper cup of cold coffee and a number that kept circling in my head. $412,000. That was what the specialist had said. Not covered. Not here. Not in Canada. Not for this particular experimental treatment for her condition, a rare autoimmune disorder that had been slowly dismantling her nervous system for the past 2 years. The covered treatments had stopped working 6 months ago. What remained was a clinical trial in Toronto, a specialist team, a procedure so new that the provincial health system hadn't yet decided whether it counted as medicine or research. Until they decided, my daughter paid out of pocket or she didn't get it at all. My daughter was 41 years old. She had 2 children of her own, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, and a husband who drove long-haul trucks and was already working every available hour. She had been a secondary school teacher in Winnipeg for 15 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered every student's name, who stayed late to help with college applications, who brought homemade butter tarts to the staff room on Fridays. She did not deserve this. None of them deserved this. I was 63 years old. I was a retired postal worker. I had a modest savings account, a small pension, and a house I'd lived in for 31 years that was worth perhaps $220,000 if the market was kind. I had already spoken to my bank. I had already called my sister in Thunder Bay. I had already done the math in every direction possible, and the answer was always the same. It wasn't enough. A woman sat down beside me. Not a nurse. Not a family member waiting the way I was waiting. She was dressed in a dark coat, a structured thing that spoke of boardrooms and not hospitals. She had the kind of stillness that comes from a life spent in professional composure. "Mrs. Okafor?" she said. I turned. "Yes. My name is Patricia Drummond. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Elliot Cavendish." The name landed without meaning. I stared at her. Mr. Cavendish is the founder of Cavendish Resource Group. He's been made aware of your daughter's situation through a mutual contact. He'd like to speak with you about a proposal. I almost said something sharp, something about privacy, about who had been sharing my daughter's medical information, and why. But Patricia Drummond opened a slim folder and placed it on the empty seat beside her, and the number on the top page stopped me cold. Full coverage of the Toronto treatment, all travel and accommodation, post-treatment care for 2 years. "He wants to help," Patricia said. "But there are conditions." She explained them to me in the same quiet, measured tone she might use to read minutes at a shareholder meeting. Mr. Cavendish was 67 years old. He had been diagnosed 18 months ago with a progressive heart condition, the kind that did not respond well to intervention. His physicians had given him, at the most optimistic estimate, 8 months. Possibly less. He had no family. He had built his company from a single nickel claim in northern Ontario into one of the largest private resource companies in the country, and he would die alone in his house outside of Kenora unless someone agreed to spend that time with him. Not as a nurse, not as a caregiver specifically, as a wife. "He is not asking for anything physical," Patricia said, and her voice did not change at all. "He is asking for companionship, presence, someone to share meals with, to speak to be there. When he passes, you would receive a formal settlement. Your daughter's treatment would be covered regardless of when that happens, from the moment the agreement is signed." I looked at my cold coffee. "This is insane," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "He knows that. He asked me to tell you he knows that." "Why me?" Patricia paused for just a moment. "He's known about your daughter's case for some time. He reads about things. He noticed that you visit her every single day. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that he wanted someone who knew what it meant to show up." I thought about my daughter upstairs. I thought about her children. I thought about the number 412,000 and how it had been the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes every morning for the past 3 weeks. "I'll meet him," I said. We drove to Kenora the following weekend, 3.5 hours west of Winnipeg along the Trans-Canada, through flat prairie that eventually folded into the rocky Canadian Shield, all granite and black spruce and frozen lakes that stretched to the horizon. The house was at the end of a long private road, set back from the edge of a lake whose name I didn't know. It was large, built from timber and stone, the kind of place that had been designed to look like it belonged to the land, rather than imposed upon it. Under the winter sky, it looked both beautiful and very lonely. Elliot Cavendish met us in the entry. He was tall, or had been, but the illness had curved him slightly forward at the shoulders. His hair was white, and he used a cane. His eyes were gray and sharp, and he assessed me with a directness that wasn't unkind, just honest. "Mrs. Okafor," he said, "thank you for coming all this way. Mr. Cavendish." He extended his hand. His grip was firm, but his fingers were cold. We sat in a room that looked out over the frozen lake, and his housekeeper, a quiet man named David who had worked for him for 22 years, brought tea without being asked. Elliot Cavendish looked at me across the low table between us and said, "I know what I'm asking is strange. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "Why not a nurse?" I asked. "Or a professional companion? Someone trained for this?" "I've had nurses," he said. "Very competent, very kind. I don't want competence, I want conversation. I want someone who has actually lived." He looked out at the lake. "I built that company for 40 years. I didn't take holidays. I didn't build relationships. I told myself there would be time later." His jaw tightened slightly. There wasn't. I understood that. I understood it in a way I hadn't expected to, sitting across from a man I'd met 11 minutes ago. "My daughter," I said. "If I sign and something happens to me, the commitment to her care still holds?" "Ironclad. Patricia will walk you through the legal structure. It's in trust, independent of anything that happens to me or to you." We were married 2 weeks later at a registry office in Kenora. David and Patricia were the witnesses. The ceremony was 5 minutes long. When the registrar asked if I took this man, I looked at Elliot Cavendish, at his white hair and his cane and his sharp gray eyes, and I said I do with the full knowledge of what I was doing and why. He looked at me when he said it too, which I had not expected. Like it meant something to him beyond logistics. Patricia drove me to the house afterward with my 2 suitcases. Elliot had a separate wing. We would share meals, Patricia explained, and common spaces. But the household was organized for his needs, and I shouldn't feel obligated to manage anything. David handled the running of the house. I should simply be present. My room faced the lake. I stood at the window that first night and watched the moonlight on the ice and tried to understand what I had done. We were awkward with each other at first, the way people are when proximity has been arranged rather than chosen. He worked in the mornings, still overseeing his company by phone and email even now, and I walked outside along the lake path when the cold permitted, which in February in northwestern Ontario was not always. David fed us well. Dinner was the meal we always shared, and for the first week we talked about safe things. The weather, what I was reading, whether the ice would hold until March. He asked about my daughter. Not about her illness, but about her, who she was, what she was like. "She's stubborn," I said, "like her father was. Once she decides something, that's the end of it. Her students love her. She coaches the junior drama club even now, even when she's exhausted." "What's her name?" "Adie's. We called her Ada growing up." He was quiet a moment. "Tell me about her when she was small." So I did. I told him about Ada at 4 years old, insisting on walking herself through the snow to the bus stop, about Ada at 12 arguing with her teacher over the interpretation of a poem and being entirely correct, about Ada at 22 standing at the front of her first classroom with chalk dust on her sleeve, looking more at home than she had ever looked anywhere. I talked for longer than I meant to. When I stopped, the tea had gone cold and the fire had burned low. "You're a good mother," Elliot said. "I'm a mother," I said. "That's all I've ever had to be." Something shifted after that evening. Not dramatically, the way things shift in stories. Quietly, the way ice moves in spring when you're not watching. He started asking me to stay after dinner. Just to talk. He told me about growing up in Sudbury, about his father who worked the mines, about the first claim he'd staked in his 20s with borrowed money, and the particular terror of waiting to find out if it was worth anything. He'd built something real from nothing, and it had cost him everything that wasn't the company. "Do you regret it?" I asked him one evening. He considered this carefully, the way he considered most things. "I regret what I didn't notice," he said, "not what I built." I regret that I was so focused on the next thing that I never looked at what was already there. I watched him over those weeks. He was disciplined about his medications, I'll say that. He kept a precise schedule, the blue pills with breakfast, the white ones at lunch, the others at night. But he was getting worse. The coughing had started in the third week, a dry sound that came at night and sometimes in the morning. He moved more slowly. By mid-March, he had stopped walking to the dock and only went as far as the porch. But he was also getting worse faster than the doctors had suggested. His cardiologist came out from Thunder Bay once a month, and after the March visit, I stood in the hallway and heard the doctor say something about the rate of deterioration being unusual for this stage. Elliot said something quiet in return that I couldn't make out. That night at dinner, he looked more tired than I had ever seen him. "How did the appointment go?" I asked. As expected. He said it in a tone that closed the door, and I didn't push. But I started paying closer attention. Patricia called twice a week. She was professional, warm even, and I had no reason to think anything of it. But I noticed, slowly, that she was the one managing all of Elliot's medical appointments. Not David, who had been with him 22 years, but Patricia, who had come to his employ 3 years ago. Patricia, who scheduled, rescheduled, communicated with the doctors, picked up his prescriptions, and brought them out from the city herself. I noticed that David sometimes looked at the pill bottles Patricia brought with an expression I couldn't quite read. I noticed that Elliot, who was precise about his medication schedule when he controlled it himself, had recently started letting Patricia manage that too, because he was tired, because it was easier. I noticed that the rate of decline had accelerated since January. Since Patricia had taken over the prescription management, it is not a comfortable thing to suspect someone of something like that. It feels paranoid. It feels like ingratitude. I sat with the suspicion for 2 weeks before I did anything, and in those 2 weeks I watched Elliot carefully and I watched Patricia carefully, and the suspicion did not go away. The thing that decided it was a Tuesday evening, Elliot had gone to bed early. David was cleaning the kitchen. I came downstairs for water and found Patricia still in the house, standing in the door of Elliot's study. She didn't hear me at first. She was looking at something on his desk, his will, I realized. The folder was open. She was reading. She heard me then and closed it in one smooth motion and turned around with an expression that stayed perfectly composed, too composed for someone caught reading a dying man's will at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. "I was just making sure the medication list was updated," she said, gesturing at nothing in particular. "Of course," I said. I went to bed and lay awake for 4 hours. The next morning I waited until Patricia left. Then I went to David. I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He looked at me for a long moment. He had never been unfriendly toward me, but he had been careful, the way people are careful when they aren't sure where loyalties should fall. Then he sat down at the kitchen table. "I've been wondering when someone would ask," he said. He told me what he knew, which was not proof of anything but was enough to make my hands cold. That Patricia had been with the company for 3 years. That in those 3 years she had very quietly moved into a position of managing more and more of Elliot's personal affairs. That she was the sole beneficiary named in a will revision from 14 months ago, when Elliot's illness had first been diagnosed, and he had been, in David's words, not himself, not thinking the way he usually thought. That the company's board had been told by Patricia that Elliot was declining faster than expected, and that transition planning should begin immediately. "He hasn't told the board that," David said. "I was in the room when he spoke to them last month. He told them he had at least another 8 months. She's been telling them something different." I drove to Kenora that afternoon. I went to a pharmacy that wasn't the one Patricia used, and I described the medications Elliot was taking, and I asked the pharmacist to tell me what she could about them. The pharmacist, an older woman with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, looked at my list and was quiet for a moment. "Some of these are consistent with cardiac treatment," she said carefully. "But this one," she pointed, "this is unusual. At this dosage, combined with these others, you'd be suppressing the effectiveness of the cardiac medication. You'd be making the heart work harder while appearing to treat it. Over several months, the cumulative effect would look very much like the natural progression of cardiomyopathy. Could it cause the deterioration to accelerate?" She looked at me over her glasses. "Is this person under a doctor's care?" "He believes he is." She wrote a number on a card and slid it across the counter. This is the Provincial Health Authority. I would suggest you also consider speaking to the RCMP. I sat in my car in the Kenora parking lot for 20 minutes. It was the first day of April. The snow was still on the ground, but the sun had that particular quality it gets in a Canadian spring, almost warm, almost convincing you that the cold is almost over. I thought about Patricia Drummond in her boardroom coat sitting beside me in a hospital waiting room, telling me Elliot Cavendish wanted someone who knew what it meant to show up. I drove back to the house and I called the RCMP. What followed was the kind of thing you hear about on the news and never imagine touching your own life. Officers came quietly, in plain clothes, while Elliot was resting. They collected the medications. They spoke to David. They asked me a long series of careful questions in the kitchen, and I answered every one of them. 2 days later, they went to Patricia Drummond's apartment in Thunder Bay and found records on her laptop, communications with 2 members of the board, a plan to broker the sale of Cavendish Resource Group within 60 days of Elliot's death at a figure that would have given her a commission in the range of several $1,000,000. They found the altered prescription records, the forged communications with the cardiologist's office. They found that there was no cardiomyopathy. There had been a mild and manageable arrhythmia, the kind treated routinely by every GP in the country. The rest had been manufactured, diagnosis by document, while Patricia slowly poisoned him toward a death that would look like natural causes. She was charged with attempted murder, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. She is currently awaiting trial. Elliot spent 9 days in the hospital in Kenora, while they cleared the accumulated medication from his system and assessed the actual state of his heart. I visited every day. On the 4th day, the cardiologist, his real cardiologist who had not been involved in any of Patricia's arrangements, came to the room and said that with proper management and some lifestyle adjustments, there was no reason Elliot Cavendish could not expect many good years ahead. Elliot sat with that information for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "I don't know what to do with this." "With what?" "With time," he said. I had organized myself around not having any. I understood that too. I had organized myself around watching him die, and around what that would mean for my daughter, and somewhere in those months I had apparently also organized myself around him, around his precise way of thinking, and his self-contained humor, and the way he looked at the lake in the mornings like he was trying to memorize it. "You learn," I said, "same way you learn everything else." "Will you stay?" he asked. It was a different question than the one Patricia had presented to me in a hospital waiting room in February. That question had been about money and survival, and there had been only one real answer. This question was about something else entirely, and I sat with it honestly before I answered. "Yes," I said, "but we're renegotiating the terms." He almost smiled. "What are your terms?" "Equal footing. I'm not here as a companion arrangement. I'm here as myself." "That's what I wanted to begin with," he said. "That's why I chose you." "Why did you choose me?" I asked. I had wondered since the beginning. He was quiet for a moment. I asked Patricia to find someone, gave her a list of qualities. Patient, honest, not interested in my money specifically. She was supposed to find someone based on that. "I think she found you because she calculated that someone with a sick daughter and an immediate financial crisis would be easy to manage." He looked at his hands. "She was wrong about that. She wasn't wrong that I needed the money. No. But needing something and being managed by it are different things. You came into my house with your own mind intact. I noticed that immediately. My daughter had her procedure in May at Toronto General. It took 14 hours. I sat in another waiting room, this time with Elliot beside me, and we drank bad coffee from paper cups and talked and didn't talk and talked again, and when the surgeon came out and said it had gone well, I did not cry politely. I cried the way you cry when you've been holding something for so long that the release of it is almost physical, and Elliot put his arm around me in a waiting room chair and I let him. Ada recovered slowly and then faster. By August, she was back in her classroom. In September, she sent me a video of her drama students performing a scene she'd written herself. Her son played the lead. Her daughter was in charge of the lighting, which she operated with profound seriousness. Elliot and I stayed in the house on the lake. We had proper conversations with a lawyer, proper agreements, proper consideration of what both of us actually wanted from whatever this had become. David, who had been Elliot's employee for 22 years, became something more like the household's conscience, which he had probably always been, In November, we drove to Winnipeg to visit Ada and her family. Elliot met my grandchildren for the first time. My grandson showed him a video game with the serious efficiency of a 9-year-old presenting important information. My granddaughter asked Elliot if he was Grandma's boyfriend with a directness that made Ada close her eyes briefly. Elliot considered the question with the same gravity he brought to everything. Yes, he said. I believe that's what I am. We established a fund through Cavendish Resource Group's charitable arm. It covers the gap cost for Canadians who fall into the space between what provincial coverage provides and what experimental or specialized treatment costs. The space my daughter had fallen into. We called it the Ada Cavendish Access Fund, which made my daughter cry and then argue with us for 20 minutes about using her name before accepting. There are people in that waiting room right now, the one at the Royal Victoria in Winnipeg, or one like it in Halifax or Calgary or Prince George, sitting with a cold cup of coffee and a number in their heads that doesn't add up. I know what that feels like. I know the particular weight of it at 3 a.m. when the options have run out and the math keeps coming up wrong. I also know that sometimes what looks like the end of options is only the end of the options you could see. Last winter, on a morning in late January, when the ice on the lake was thick and perfect, and the sky was the hard, clear blue that only exists in a Canadian winter, Elliot and I stood on the dock and watched the sun come up over the tree line. He had a proper coat on. His cane was in his other hand. His heart, properly medicated and no longer systematically undermined, was beating the way it was meant to, he said. Do you remember the first time you saw this lake? It was dark, I said. I thought it looked very lonely. It was. He looked out at the ice. Not anymore. I thought about the frost on the hospital windows in Winnipeg, about Ada upstairs in her room with machines and hope and a number I couldn't make add up, about a woman in a dark coat saying he wants someone who knows what it means to show up. I had shown up for my daughter my entire life. I had shown up for my students when I volunteered at the library reading program, for my neighbors, for anyone who needed someone to be present and steady. I hadn't known, sitting in that waiting room in February, that showing up for a stranger would lead me here, to this dock, to this morning, to a life I hadn't imagined when I thought my life was mostly finished. There is a particular kind of love that doesn't arrive like weather. It arrives the way spring does in this part of the country, so slowly that you don't notice it happening, and then one morning the ice has shifted, and the geese are back, and the world smells like cold water and new mud, and something beginning, and you realize it has been happening the whole time while you were looking elsewhere. That is the kind I found. Late and sideways, and nothing like the stories I was told to expect. Better, actually. Better because it was built out of real things. Out of desperation and attention and the specific quality of someone who sits with you in a waiting room when they don't have to, and who asks about your daughter not because they should, but because they want to know. The geese come back in April now. Elliot counts them. He says he never noticed them before, all those years. He notices everything now, so do I.